Hello dear students, welcome back to Bajirao IAS Academy, UPSC Mains 2024 question paper analysis. And in this session, we are going to discuss General Studies paper 3, right? So, first few questions of General Studies paper 3 will try to discuss, and we'll also understand the nature of the questions and how UPSC has been asking questions and how we can actually attempt these questions. And that is very important because this particular session will give you a lot of insights into how the answers have to be written for General Studies paper 3 questions. And in fact, if you look at the syllabus of General Studies paper 3, I hope all of you have already gone through the syllabus of General Studies paper 3. And if I can mention those syllabus topics specifically, it deals with the Indian economy at large. So Indian economy at large is dealt by this particular General Studies paper 3. Apart from that, it also deals with the Indian agriculture sector. Apart from Indian agriculture sector, infrastructure is another area that this particular paper talks about. And apart from infrastructure, it also deals with the environment and ecology section, biodiversity, climate change. So everything is being dealt by this particular. So this is first section, second section, and third section. It also deals with science and technology as well. And fourth, so it also deals with the internal security as well, particularly when we talk about the internal security topic. So it specifically talks about or deals with uh, terrorism and insurgency, left wing extremism, money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking. So, all these issues are being dealt by the internal security aspect and even internal migration as well, because the illegal migration is one of the problem that we have been facing. And in fact, when it comes to the illegal migration, we very often see this kind of a migration from countries, particularly the bordering countries of India, Myanmar and Bangladesh, and even to some extent Pakistan and even Sri Lanka also. And science and technology, especially about DRDO and recent scientific advancements in DRDO, and even it also deals with the space and even Ministry of Science and Technology, and recent innovations in the field of science and technology are the areas generally questions are being asked from the science and technology. And even it also deals with the biotechnology as well, biotechnology, new pandemics, etc. So everything is being dealt by this science and technology portion. So we all knew that environment, what kind of questions are being asked. So environment, ecology, biodiversity, conservation, climate change. So those kind of questions. And other topic that I forgot is disaster management, right? So disaster management is also another area that this particular paper deals with, disaster management. So because India is vulnerable to a wide variety of disasters, cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis, and landslides, floods, droughts. So all these kind of disasters. So therefore, you need to read about all these different kinds of disasters, and you should also have some sort of information about these disasters and disaster proneness of different regions across India. And apart from that, you need to talk about the Indian economy, Indian agriculture, and infrastructure. So all these areas are very, very important, right? So therefore, we'll try to discuss all these questions in a very detailed manner. And the first question which is asked this year's paper is about the inclusive growth. So remember that I've told you that Indian economy is one of the syllabus topics of General Studies paper 3, and within Indian economy, inclusive growth. And if you look at the syllabus of General Studies paper 3, they've specifically mentioned about the inclusive growth. And that's why it is very important that you need to identify all the syllabus topics, and you need to maintain at least short notes or concise or brief notes on these particular topics. So that will help you a lot, coming up with the best possible answer, right? So you need to know the definition of inclusive growth. What does inclusive growth actually means, right? So the question is, the examine pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services in the post-reforms period in India. To what extent this has been in consonance with achieving the objectives of inclusive growth. So we'll try to deconstruct this particular question, right? So when we tried to deconstruct this question, uh, you know, public expenditure. So public expenditure is the government expenditure in one particular period of time in social welfare programs that the government has launched, the infrastructure development projects, and various other expenditure of the government, particularly aimed at the larger welfare of the public and the development of the nation, and that is known as the public expenditure. And in the first part of the question, it is asked that you need to analyze or examine the pattern and trend of public expenditure on the social services, particularly the post-reform period in India. Now, when I say services, so social services includes education, healthcare, and even employment generation, skill development. So all these things comes under the social services, right? So therefore, we need to examine the pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services in the post-reforms period in India. So 1991. So we have introduced LPG reforms, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So after 1991 economic reforms, we have introduced LPG reforms. And post these reforms, what is the pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services in India? And then in the second part of the answer, you need to write to what extent this has been in consonance with achieving the objectives of the inclusive growth. Now, when I say inclusive growth, what does inclusive growth actually means? Now, inclusive growth essentially means that the growth or the development, so which the fruits of the growth of development are distributed across all sections of the society equitably, and it also provides equal opportunities for all. And inclusive growth essentially in a very simple term means that no one left behind in the growth or in the development, right? So these are some of the essential elements of inclusive growth. I hope you have understood what is inclusive growth. So some of the important elements of inclusive growth include poverty reduction, industrial development, reduction in regional disparities, environmental protection, and equal distribution of income, social sector development, and even agriculture development and employment generation. So all these are essential and important elements of inclusive growth. And what should be the approach for this particular question? So when you look into the approach of this particular question, is that first and foremost, what you have to do, you need to define inclusive growth in the introduction, and then you can also write some specific data on the expenditure post reform period on the social services. And then you need to examine the pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services in the post-reform period. And then you need to discuss whether this expenditure helped in achieving inclusive growth or not. And then ultimately you need to conclude the answer with appropriate suggestion to achieve inclusive growth. So this is how you need to structure the answer, and this is how you need to write the approach of this particular question. Now, in the introduction itself, so what should be the introduction for this particular question? So, as I've already told you that whenever there are questions on good governance, electronic governance, or e-governance, or even this inclusive growth, sustainable development, so you can write the definitions which are being given by some organizations or agencies such as World Bank, UNESCO, organizations for economic cooperation and development. So that makes your answer more and more specific and more impactful when examiner looks at the introduction, data specific introduction. It creates a very good impression on your answer. So in the introduction, as per the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, inclusive growth is economic growth, so that is distributed fairly across the society, and it also creates opportunities for all, right? So that is the inclusive growth. So I hope that this definition of inclusive growth comes very close, or it is associated very closely with the what I've told you about the inclusive growth, because I've told you that no one is left behind, and in this definition of OECD, inclusive growth is economic growth that is distributed fairly across society, and it also creates opportunities for everyone and no one left behind. And in fact, since 1991 LPG reforms, so in 1991 we have introduced LPG reforms, liberalization, globalization, and privatization. So at that point of time, it was imperative for us to open our economy, because we no longer sustain our economy if we don't open our economy. Earlier, our economy was not linked with the other countries when globalization was, you know, making deeper inroads into different countries. But due to some reasons, we have opened up our economy through 1991 economic reforms. And since 1991 economic reforms, it is being evident from the analysis of the available data that there has been a steady increase in the public spending on social services, particularly in the areas of education, healthcare, social security. So, despite this, the spending has often lagged behind the needs, right? So the government, even though the expenditure on social services has increased significantly or substantially on different areas, but not at the desirable levels, right? So not at desirable levels. No, not at desirable levels means, for example, if I can give you one example. So in India, expenditure on healthcare is less than 1.5 percentage of the GDP on healthcare. But a lot of countries have been spending more than 3 percentage of GDP on their healthcare. And in fact, healthcare also plays a very, very important role when it comes to the human resources development of human capital development. So therefore, in this context, it is imperative that India needs to spend a lot of money on these social services, or social expenditure needs to be increased in India. So this is how you need to introduce the answer. And in the next part of the question, so you just examine the pattern and the trends of public expenditure on social services in the post-reform period. So this would be the next part of the question. So we all knew that the economic reforms were introduced in the year 1991, and in this particular period, this is considered as the first phase, 1991 to 2000. This is the first phase after the economic reforms. So in this particular period, public expenditure on social services. So when I say social services, there are certain sectors, right? So for example, healthcare is part of the social service, and education is also part of the social services, and even social welfare. So all these things are, part of the social services. So therefore, in this first period, the social services spending or social welfare expenditure is relatively limited, as the focus was largely on the economic stabilization and literacy. Because remember that when India opened up its economy due to some reasons, for example, we used to have a huge trade deficit, so we don't have enough forex reserves, and in fact, the foreign direct investments are very low in India because Indian economy was not opened for the foreign direct investments. So and inflation is also very high. So in the first phase of the after the LPG reforms, our immediate priorities were economic stabilization and liberalization. And because of that reason, the social welfare spending or social services spending is relatively low or limited, and that is the factor which has limited the social services spending. And there was an emphasis on sorry, there was also an emphasis on reducing the fiscal deficits, and as a result, sectors like healthcare and education received lower budgetary allocations. And in fact, despite the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act is being passed, and this particular legislative framework has also imposed certain restrictions on the government's fiscal deficits. But despite that, the governments have seen higher fiscal deficit, particularly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So since governments have the fiscal deficit obligations, so governments have been borrowing a lot of money, and governments borrowing a lot of money. So since government don't have adequate money, governments focus on social services such as healthcare and education have received a lower budgetary allocations during this first phase after the economic reforms. However, in the 11th and 12th 5-year plans, so 2007 to 2017 saw a more robust focus on social sectors to support human capital development. Remember, the social welfare expenditure or expenditure on social services, particularly education and healthcare, forms a very important component of human capital development. So, therefore, the 12th 5-year plan, so inclusive growth. So 12th 5-year plan has also focused on inclusive growth. So this particular plan period, there was a robust focus on social sectors to support human capital development. So, however, in the 11th and 12th 5-year plans, so as I've already explained that there was a huge support for the human capital development. When I say human capital development, the government started increasing the social welfare expenditure on education, healthcare, social security, skill development, right? Skill development, nutrition. So all these areas the government started further enhancing its investments, further enhancing its capital. So, however, in the post 2005 era, there were a lot of flagship programs that the government has launched, particularly Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Right. So, we all knew that this particular Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act provides 100 days of legal guarantee of work to every rural household who is ready to work, who is willing to take up the unskilled manual labor. And in fact, we all knew that Manreka usually provides income security for the people. So it provides income security for the people in rural areas, and it also creates large scale community resources as well. So it creates community resources, and it also provides income security for the people as well. So therefore, in this particular backdrop, Manreka is a very, very important program because one third of the total beneficiaries of the Manreka program should be women, and it also leads to the self reliance and economic independence of the woman over a period of time. It also leads to the economic empowerment or overall empowerment of the woman, and it also prevents the migration into the urban areas from the rural areas. So post 2005 era, after the LPG reforms, so government has launched certain flagship programs such as Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and National Rural Health Mission and Right to Education Act. So they marked as increase in public spending and even on different welfare programs. And these schemes focused on employment generation, healthcare, education. So that would reflect shift towards prioritizing the inclusive growth by the government. So between 2010 and 2020, so allocations on different social services such as education, healthcare, and social security grow at a higher rate, and that particularly reflects government commitments to the inclusive growth. Because remember that whenever we see that the government has been spending a lot of money on these social services, so we could say that the government is committed to achieve inclusive growth as quickly as possible, or achieving inclusive growth in a sustainable manner. That the government consistently increasing its expenditure on the social services. So even educational share in GDP has been improved over a period of time. So with the national target of 6% of the GDP spending on education. Remember, we have not yet achieved 6% of the GDP spending on education, but the government aimed at achieving 6% GDP on education, though actual expenditure on education is near about 3.5 to 4%. Remember also that the expenditure on healthcare is also not more than 1.5 percentage, and in fact, the national health policy has also been emphasized. National Health Policy 2017 emphasized that the government should spend at least 3% of its GDP on the healthcare sector, and that is very important to ensure or to achieve universal health coverage. And in the next part of the answer, you need to discuss whether this expenditure helped in achieving inclusive growth or not, because we have seen that the government has spent a lot of money on these social services, but the objective is to achieve inclusive growth. Now, we have understood what are the essential components of inclusive growth. So, in the beginning of this question itself, for example, employment creation, poverty alleviation, literacy rates, women empowerment. So, all these things are part of or essential elements of inclusive growth. So, how this expenditure has led to achieving inclusive growth? So, health access for the poor ensured through schemes like Ayushman Bharat scheme. So that has these, I hope you knew about this Ayushman Bharat scheme, because yesterday also we have discussed about this Ayushman Bharat program. So it provides 5 lakh health insurance for the every household, right? So in fact, this scheme has also recently extended for people or individuals who are above 70 years of age as well. And in fact, this Ayushman Bharat health insurance program improved healthcare access for the economically weaker sections, and in fact a lot of people are being covered under the social welfare programs, and that is very important that people getting adequate healthcare at affordable prices, and they can also substantially reduces their out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure. And balanced regional development, so focus on backward regions through initiatives like aspirational districts program. So we all knew that Niti Aayog has launched Aspirational Districts program to promote regional equity, improve socio-economic indicators, and 112 backward districts as per the Niti Aayog. And in fact, financial inclusion has been greatly boosted by expanding rural banks and even schemes like Jan Dhan Yojana or JAM Trinity, because JEAM Trinity played a very important role in weeding out the exclusion errors and also weeding out the fake beneficiaries, and whoever is the genuine beneficiary, the beneficiary has been getting the benefits of various welfare programs through the direct benefit transfer, because Jan Dhan Yojana has made, or Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity has made, that this direct benefit transfer is much more efficient and effective as well. And in fact, in the year 23-24 financial year, India's overall gross domestic product is estimated to at 7.3 percentage compared to 7.2 percentage a year ago. And in fact, we have been experiencing a medium level of economic growth rate because of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact. Currently, we are recovering from the worst impact of the pandemic. So, but despite the pandemic, Indian economy is resilient to withstand the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has been performing better. So, at 7.3 percentage in the financial year 23-24. So that's why Indian economy is known as one of the fastest growing, the global largest economy in the world. And in fact, because of the huge economic growth that we have been achieving. So we are also substantially reducing the levels of poverty across India. So a total of 415 million people moved out of poverty in India within just 15 years from 2005 to 2021 as per the UN records. So in this context, what has to be done by the government to achieve inclusive growth, and how government can substantially improve the social welfare, social services spending. Now, in this context, it is very important that government must exclude the ghost beneficiaries, or government must weed out the leakages and corruption existing in the social welfare expenditure. And government should also identify all the genuine beneficiaries, and the benefits should be transferred to the genuine beneficiaries through the Jandan Aadhaar Trinity or Jandan Yojana. So this is a very, very important aspect when it comes to ensuring the efficiency or effectiveness of the resources transfer to the people. And apart from that, the government should adequately focus on education, healthcare, and skill development of the people, because that is one primary aspect that if government wanted to achieve inclusive growth. So therefore, overall, it is very important for a country to achieve inclusive growth, because we have a huge regional inequalities and income inequalities as well. So we must get rid of these regional inequalities, income inequalities in India, and we are moving towards 2047 with the aspiration or with the goal of becoming a developed country overtaken by 2047, and that could be ensured, or that could be achieved only through inclusive growth, right? So that's all in this particular question. So I hope you have understood the this particular question in a very detailed manner. And next question is about the food inflation, rising food inflation in India, and comment on the effectiveness of monetary policy of the Reserve Bank of India to control this type of inflation. Right. So I hope all of you have a basic understanding, or you knew the definition of inflation. So inflation is the general rise in the prices of goods, right? So, or commodities. So that is inflation. So inflation is a common phenomenon in any economy that we generally observe, right? So with inflation, generally what happens, the prices of the goods and services would increase over a period of time. So, in fact, when it comes to increase in the prices of food items, so it is known as food inflation. But in India, as of now, we are observing there is a high level of food inflation. Now, we need to identify the causes why there is a higher level of food inflation in India, and that is the first part of the question. And in the second part of the question, so you need to comment on the monetary policy of Reserve Bank of India to control this type of inflation. Now, how monetary policy can effectively control this food inflation in the second part of the question. And I hope you knew about this monetary policy committee, right? So monetary policy committee's core objective is to control inflation and achieve economic growth. So that is the core objective of the monetary policy committee, and monetary policy committee regularly decides repo rate, and it also decides the reverse repo rate, right? So reverse repo rate. So all these things are being decided by the monetary policy committee of the Reserve Bank of India, and along with that, it also decides the bank rate as well, right? So bank rate and even open market operations, open market operations. So everything is being decided by the RBI. So with the objective of ensuring growth and also controlling the inflation in the economy. So the structuring of this answer is very easy. So if you look at how this answer could be structured, so first and foremost, you have to define what constitutes food inflation, and you could, if you want, you could give some data with respect to that, and then discuss the causes of persistently higher levels of food inflation in India, and then comment on the effectiveness of monetary policy of Reserve Bank of India to control this type of higher inflation. And ultimately, you need to conclude the answer with certain government initiatives to control the food inflation. So this is how you need to write the approach for this question. And if you want, you can also go through the differences between wholesale price index and consumer price index. And this is very important for mains examination as well as prelims examination also. So I would like to remind you that UPSC has also asked about the wholesale price index and consumer price index in prelims examination as well. So if you look at the previous year questions, so you can see questions based on this as well. So you can go through the wholesale price index and as well as the consumer price index as well. So in the introduction, as I have already told you, that you need to briefly define what constitutes the food inflation, and you can also give some data with respect to the food inflation, because in question it is said that there is a consistently higher levels of food inflation being observed in India. So food inflation refers to the sustained increase in the prices of food products. So we purchase a lot of food products, food grains, pulses, cereals, and vegetables. But the food prices also regularly increase. But what about people who are poor, who are below poverty line, because they cannot afford the basic commodities if the prices are very high, and that would result in problems like hunger, malnutrition, and under this child stunting, child wasting, and even mortalities because of the hunger and mortality rates, hunger and malnutrition. So therefore, food inflation generally refers to the sustained increase in the prices of food products. So, food products prices will increase over a period of time. That has been a persistent challenge in India, and in fact, that impacts household significantly. And year on year inflation rate based on this All India Consumer Price Index number is 5.66% for the month of August 2024. So, with the food inflation having weight of around 46% of the total consumer price index basket. So remember, I told you that there are two different types of inflation: consumer price inflation and wholesale price inflation. So consumer price inflation is very important because it covers a large basket of goods at the consumer level, and this food prices are also covered under the consumer price index. And in fact, so out of the total weight of the consumer price index, 46% of the weight comes from the food products alone. And in fact, the Reserve Bank of India cannot ignore the food inflation while formulating monetary policy because of its huge importance in the consumer price index. Now, what are the causes of persistently higher levels of food inflation in India? There are certain causes for the higher inflation, higher food inflation in India. For example, so in India, we have observing that there are different weather or temperature conditions existing, because there are rising temperatures or the bad weather impacting the agriculture and agricultural production, and that is a cause of concern, and in fact that is a sign of worry in the Indian agriculture. So there are issues like adverse weather conditions such as prediction of weak monsoon and heat wave for this year affecting the crop yields, particularly pulses, cereals, and sugar. In fact, these items requires ample amount of water to grow, and that contributed to the supply shortages and higher prices domestically. And apart from that, we need to talk about the fuel prices as well. So when we talk about the fuel prices, the prices of fuel. So fuel is another key input in the agriculture sector. So in fact, crude oil prices have been increasing because of the global volatility, and within India itself, since this crude oil or so oil is not part of the GST, the prices of the oil, diesel, so has significantly enhanced, and that also has a certain impact on the increase in the food inflation. And apart from that, there are a lot of supply chain disruptions across the economy and even at the global level. And supply chain disruptions also a cause of concern when it comes to the increasing the food products prices. Now, what are the major factors which causes supply chain disruptions with respect to the food inflation, including transportation constraints which are existing? Because you need to transport the vegetables and other food items from one part of the country to the other part of the country, from rural areas to the other urban areas. And in recent times, due to different weather conditions, so the connectivity is being cut off, the roads are being cut off, and that has been creating transportation constraints, and even increasing the fuel prices, also creating the transportation constraints for the farmers as well, because it would be more and more costly for the farmers to transport goods from the nearby rural areas to the urban areas to any other part of the country, and that is a cause of concern. And even there's a lot of labor shortage, because in Indian agriculture sector, so wages are low. Wages are low and women are not getting adequate wages, and that has been creating labor shortages. And in fact, people are also migrating from the rural areas to urban areas, and there are a lot of logistic challenges, and all these factors have been leading to the decrease in the availability of food products, and that has been causing prices to increase or prices to rise. And we should not forget the global effect on the increasing food prices. So what sort of a global effect it actually has? So while global food prices decreased, India's food prices remained high because of the limited transmission of international prices to domestic markets. So the Russia-Ukraine war acted as a deterrent. India heavily dependent on imports of edible oils. So 60% of the consumption of edible oil comes from these conflict countries and pulses. But for the most other agricultural commodities like cereals, sugar, dairy, fruits and vegetables, it is an exporter. So these are some of the factors which have been resulting in the rise in the prices of food grains. So apart from that, you need to talk about the effectiveness of monetary policy of Reserve Bank of India to control food inflation. So regularly, RBI's monetary policy committee meet and take decisions on controlling inflation and also maintaining growth rate. So how RBI's monetary policy committee needs to take action to control or to regulate the rising food inflation in India. So in this context, RBI can actually increase the interest rates, so that will help curb the inflation rate. Now, how increasing the interest rates, how increasing interest rates will help curb inflation in India, right? So this is a very important thing that we need to understand, that so increasing interest rates will make borrowing money would be very costly. So Reserve Bank of India is a very well known as a banker to the banks. So if any other banks across India wanted money, so they approach the Reserve Bank of India, and Reserve Bank of India lend some money to these banks. So at a certain interest rate. So if RBI increases the interest rates while borrowing, lending money to the other banks in India. So generally, what happens that banks are getting loans from the RBI at a higher interest rates. So banks also give loans to the consumers at a higher interest rate. So since higher interest rates, generally people are not ready to borrow money from the banks. So that would to some extent reduce the circulation of money, and reduction in the circulation of the money will make that there's not enough money in the economy, and that would reduces the demand for money. So that increases the demand for money, and that would help curb the inflation, right? So when RBI increases money interest rates, so that would reduces money supply, and it also cools off demand for the goods and services. However, this does little to address the root causes of food inflation, such as poor crop yield and even supply chain issues as well. And apart from that, the liquidity control is another area that has to be focused. So by tightening liquidity in the market, so the Reserve Bank of India attempts to reduce overall inflationary pressures, but again, food inflation often persists due to non-monetary reasons such as poor agricultural output or distribution inefficiencies which are being existed. So, however, apart from this, the other area that RBI can focus on to reduce the inflation or inflationary pressures, that the government is increasing the distribution of subsidized vegetables such as onions, tomatoes, through its network and releasing stocks of wheat and sugar to stabilize the prices as well. And apart from that, reduction in import duty would be another area there through which the food inflation can be substantially reduced. Right, so to enhance domestic production, government is incentivizing the pulses cultivation because remember that when we talk about the pulses, India is the largest consumer of pulses, and we have been importing pulses from African countries such as Tanzania and Mozambique. So we have dependent on pulses a lot. So when we are importing pulses from other countries, of course, it costs us a lot of money. So therefore, the government of India has been focusing on cultivation of pulses across different agroclimatic zones in India itself, and that will ensure that we will substantially reduce our import dependency on the pulses, and we could produce pulses on our own, and that will also help us reduce food inflation as well in the longer period of time. So remember that this is not a short-term measure of the government. So this is the long-term measure of the government. So however, so rising food, prices is a cause of concern, is a sign of worry in the economy because there are a lot of poor people, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people went back to the poverty, back into the poverty. So therefore, in this context, we cannot afford higher food prices. So at any cost, so Reserve Bank of India has to come up with the appropriate measures that would ensure that these food prices are under control. And apart from that, the government should incentivize and encourage agriculture, particularly the horticulture, and that is also a very important step the government should undertake, to control food inflation. And government should also provide incentives to the farmers in these rural areas. So all these factors could ensure that the food inflation is under control, and agriculture needs to be made resilient to the negative impacts of the climate change. So mitigation and adaptation measures have to be undertaken in Indian agriculture, because remember that more than 50% of India's population is still dependent on the agriculture sector. So therefore, in this context, it is very important that the Indian agriculture sector should be more and more resilient, and we need to reduce our import dependencies, and that's how we could reduce the overall import dependency in India. So next very important question. So this is a 150 word question. So remember that the land reforms is also a very important question. So if I'm not wrong, in 2021 also UPSC has asked about the land reforms. In 2022 also UPSC has asked about the land reforms, and 2024 again UPSC asked about the land reforms. So this is a very important area to for the UPSC to ask questions. Right. So question is very simple. So the question is, what were the factors responsible for the successful implementation of land reforms in some parts of the country? So you just mentioned those factors which are responsible for the successful implementation of the land reforms. So that's it, right? So since 150 words, so you can answer. You can stress more on the factors which are responsible for the successful implementation of land reforms. Now, before discussing that, we need to understand the objectives of the land reforms. There are certain objectives. Because of that reason, the governments after independent India, governments in independent India have come up with the land reforms. And so, what are those objectives? So, the objectives are multifaceted, and they include the end of exploitation of the farmers under the original holders of the land, because at that point of time there were people like jamindars, and they used to hold huge tracts of land, and they used to exploit the farmers, and they used to extract the labors forcefully from the farmers or the tillers of the land. So land reforms would end the exploitation of the farmers, and it would also promote equity and social justice, and it would lead to the redistribution of land to the landless, and it incentivizes investment by the farmers, promote agricultural development, promote security of tenure, and encourage more demand through redistribution of income. And it also reduces land conflicts and ensures social stability as well. So these are the objectives of the land reforms, right? So remember that these objectives of the land reforms are very important. You have to keep in mind, and so this particular presentation or this particular diagram is very helpful for your examination, right? So how we can structure this answer? So when it comes to the structure of the answer, first and foremost you need to briefly explain, so what are these land reforms that were introduced in India after independence. in the introduction, and then you need to discuss some factors which are responsible for the successful implementation of the land reforms in some parts of the country, and discuss challenges of land reforms. Because in states like Kerala and West Bengal, the land reforms were successfully implemented, and we need to look into those factors which have contributed for the successful implementation of land reforms in these states. But while there is a failure of implementation of land reforms in other states, so you need to discuss the challenges of land reforms, and then you need to conclude the answer by stressing on the need for a second land reforms. Okay, so second generation land reforms. So what is a land reforms? You can define, you can talk about land reforms. You can describe land reforms in a very brief manner in the introduction itself. So land reforms in India, they aimed at promoting equity, right? So it's not just about the equality in the society, rather equity when it comes to the land distribution, and through distribution of land empowering the agrarian community, particularly the backward sections of the Indian society in the rural areas. So that is what is land reforms, right? So it aimed to promote equity in land distribution, and it also aimed to empower the agrarian community as well. So the successful implementation of these reforms in certain states can be attributed to a combination of political will, social movements, effective administration, and the supportive policies. So these are the certain reasons. For example, when it comes to states where the land reforms are successfully implemented, West Bengal and Kerala, so political will of the governments which were existing at that point of time is one reason for the successful implementation of land reforms, and social movements, because in Kerala and West Bengal states, communism or communist movements were widely prevalent, and in fact, Naxalite movement or left-wing extremism movement was started at a place called Naxalbari in West Bengal itself, and effective administration and supportive policies of the respective governments or the multifaceted factors which are responsible for the successful implementation of these reforms in different areas. Now, in this context, what are the factors responsible for the successful implementation of land reforms in some parts of the country? So, there are certain reasons for the successful implementation of land reforms in some parts of the country. For example, those states or those regions have access to resources. Initiatives that were started in the years 1950s, particularly the Bhudan movement and Gramdan movement, they were launched by the Acharya Vinoba Bhave, and they played a very important, a very prominent role when it comes to the distribution of land to the landless. Right? So, voluntarily, the landed communities donated land responding to the Acharya Vinoba Bhave's Bhudan movement and Gramdan movement, and after that, the land was donated to the landless communities within that particular villages. And in fact, a lot of or several wealthy landowners donated their land to the landless poor, and this movement also ensured that the beneficiaries had access to credit and resources to make the productive use of newly acquired land. So once the landless have got the land, the governments, what the governments have made, the government ensured that these people who have got the land, newly, so they would have access to credit and also other important resources, so that they can use the productive use of the land which is newly acquired. And in fact, supportive economic conditions is also another reason for the successful implementation of the land reforms. So there are certain states such as Karnataka. So Karnataka has introduced better irrigation facilities and also market access for the agricultural products. Remember, in independent India, even after 75 years, there is lack of proper irrigation infrastructure in Indian agriculture, and because of that reason, so Indian agriculture is still dependent on the monsoon rainfall. So that's why Indian agriculture is known as the rain-fed agriculture. So introduction of better irrigation facilities and market access for the agricultural products has encouraged beneficiaries to invest in their land and enhancing both productivity and economic outcomes as well. So effective bureaucratic structure would be another reason, because a well-functioning bureaucracy facilitated the efficient implementation of the land reforms as well. So at that point of time, bureaucracy was committed. So therefore, well-functioning bureaucracy has facilitated the efficient implementation of the land reforms. And grassroots participation would be another reason. So when we talk about the grassroots participation, so at the panchayat levels and even at the local levels, people's participation or active involvement of community has ensured effective implementation of these land reforms. And in fact, Tamil Nadu has come up with a policy or the program called Ma Vajavu. So this particular program has empowered the local communities in decision making and fostering ownership, and also ensuring reforms were attuned to the local needs as well. So there are certain challenges when it comes to the implementation of land reforms. Now, what are those challenges? So when we talk about the challenges, the state governments have often had a weak political will to enforce land reform legislation. So this often due to pressure from the land owning elites. So a lot of land owning elites were not ready to distribute or give land to the landless people, and even they also very often tried to escape from the legislations that the government has passed. For example, the Land Ceiling Act has made a certain restrictions on owning a land more than a particular limit. So apart from that, corruption in the bureaucracy would be another major reason. So land records are often outdated and inaccurate, which makes it difficult to implement the land reforms as well. So there is often a gap that was existing between land distribution and actual occupation of beneficiaries. So this is due to the physical prevention, litigation, and inability of the beneficiaries to afford the land distribution. So these are some of the reasons, and even social inequalities were also existing in a larger scale. So caste hierarchies in some states have led to the resistance from the dominant land owning groups, and even there is also a nexus between the lower level officials and zamindars that would lead to the corruption as well. So these are some of the reasons which over a period of time led to the failure of effective implementation of land reforms in India. So the pace of implementation of land reform measures has been very slow, and the objective of social justice has, however, been achieved to a considerable degree. So, however, there is a need for the second generation land reforms across India, because since even after land reforms were started implementing, land reforms were implemented after independence. Those land reforms were not very successful, except few states. So there are a lot of landless people who are existing, and that is one reason for the existence of the rural poverty and the migration of people from the rural areas to urban areas, exploitation of the agrarian communities or people from the certain backgrounds. So therefore, no doubt that land reform has a great role in a rural agrarian economy. It has, to some extent, has achieved equity, so that dominated by land and agriculture. And new and innovative land reform measures should be adopted with a vigor to eradicate the rural poverty. So land reforms are very well linked with the rural poverty alleviation. So in order to alleviate the poverty, it is very important that we need to start a new age and new generation land reforms in India. So next, very important question. This is also 150 word question. So the question is, explain the role of millets for ensuring health and nutrition security in India. So in India, millets play a very important role. So we all knew about that, the role that millets actually play. So we have the problem of malnutrition, right? So we have the problem of malnutrition, and apart from malnutrition, there are also problems like child stunting, child stunting, child wasting, child stunting, and even problems like hidden hunger. Right? So all these problems can be successfully eliminated or eradicated through the promotion of consumption of millets by the people. But as of now, these millets are not adequately produced or in India or cultivated in India. The government has been undertaking a lot of measures to cultivate or to promote cultivation of millets. So, because millets consumption would ensure nutritional security for the country and also health for the consumers as well, right? So, because millets can address the problem of malnutrition, child stunting, child wasting. It can also address the problem of hidden hunger, because hidden hunger further leads to several other problems or a lot of diseases. So therefore, millets conservation has to be encouraged. And in fact, there are a lot of agroclimatic zones across different parts of the country, and those agroclimatic zones support the cultivation of these millets. Now, in this context, what should be the approach of this question? So, when we talk about the approach of this question, so first and foremost, you need to briefly write some data on malnutrition in India in the introduction, and then you need to discuss the role of millets for ensuring health and nutritional security in India, and then you need to discuss challenges and promotion of millets, and ultimately you need to conclude the answer by adaptive government initiatives. So this is how, in a very simple manner, because no complex words are being attached to this question. This is very simple question, so 150 words. And in fact, you can also see in this image that there are a lot of multifaceted health benefits because of the millets. So you can also go through all the health benefits of the millets, and that's why it is very important to consume the millets or promote consumption of millets by the Indian consumers. So when we talk about the millets, millets are a group of small seeded grasses, right? So a small seeded grasses, they are a group of small seeded grasses, and that are grown as grains and are staple food in many parts of the world. And in fact, millets are a type of grain that used for food, fodder, feed, and biofuels. So for this particular purpose, millets are being used, and they are also known as mota anaj in Hindi. So that's how you can write a brief introduction about the millets. So after writing a brief introduction about the millets, and then you need to write role of millets in ensuring health and nutritional security in India. So how can we ensure the health and nutritional security of India through consumption of millets? So millets are good source of protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals like iron, calcium, and zinc. And in fact, these nutrients also contain essential amino acids like lysine, tyrosine, and valine. Millets also release glucose into the bloodstream very slowly, and in fact, these millets consumption would also help manage diabetes and also the cardiovascular diseases that the people have been facing. And millets are naturally considered as gluten free. So when any food product or even millets are gluten free, so they make a very good option for the people with celiac disease or even the gluten intolerance. So there's also high fiber content within this millets. And in fact, millets also help maintain a healthy digestive system, and they also prevent obesity and diabetes among the people. So these are some of the benefits because of the millets. And apart from that, so millets also have the magnesium. So they contain magnesium, which can help reduce the hyperlipidemia and even risk of heart diseases. And antioxidants, millets releases rich antioxidants, and that is very very important to improve the immuno response or immunity response. And in fact, pearl millet, which is also known as bajra, is very high in macronutrients and even micronutrients, particularly zinc, iron, magnesium, and folic acid. And finger millet, which is also known as a ragi, is high in calcium and polyunsaturated fatty acids as well. So, however, there are certain challenges in promoting millets. We need to look into those challenges. Now, what are the challenges when it comes to promoting millets? So, there is a decline in the area under the millet cultivation in India. So millets were earlier cultivated in an area of 35 million hectares of land, right? So in this area, millets are being cultivated, but it is now being grown in only 15 million hectares alone. So the reasons for the shift in the land use include low yields, time consuming, and laborious tasks in processing of millets, which are undertaken by the women. So there's also lack of awareness when it comes to the consumption of millets. So many people in India are not aware of the health benefits of millets, leading to a lower demand of millets and lower consumption of. Even in India, when millets are available, but millets are not consumed by the people because lack of awareness about the health benefits of the millets. And in fact, in India, millets are very often overpriced and they are very costly. So compared to the traditional cereals, so thereby making them less accessible to the low income consumers in India. So since they are less accessible because lack of affordability of people to these high cost millets. So this would also result in a lot of healthcare problems and a limited availability of the millets because millets are not generally cultivated across all parts of the country. There are only few areas where millets are being cultivated. So Compared to cereals, availability of millets is a very limited. So therefore, making it difficult for the consumers to purchase these millets as well. And competition from rice and wheat would also be another major reason. So rice and wheat are staple foods in India and are widely available, making it difficult for the millets to compete in the market. However, when it comes to the programs that the government has already launched when it comes to the millet consumption, so National Millet Mission (NMM) was launched in the year 2007 to promote the production and consumption of the millets by the government. And the government has also launched the price support system or price support scheme to provide financial assistance for the farmers for the cultivation of millets. And then government also launched, promoting or providing millets through the public distribution system. So government has introduced millets in the public distribution system to make it accessible and affordable to the masses as well. Right. So this is how you can address this particular answer, and that's all in this lecture. And thank you so much. So if you like our work, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.